And welcome back, and thanks for being with us here on Morning Live on this Youth Day edition of the show. Now, the South African Institute of International Affairs, that's SAIIA, recently brought together more than 150 young people to compile a report on the state and the future of governance in South Africa. Now, the outcomes identified 9 governance areas that the youth believe the government should tackle. Now, the issues include land and housing, economic empowerment, climate change, youth political participation, among others. And the report also found that despite having a youth constituency of over 60% of the population, young South Africans are consistently excluded from policy-making processes. Barriers to participation include a closed political system for those not active in politics, also tokenism, the proportional representation electoral system, and limited access to funding, among others. And joining us now for a further discussion about these and other matters affecting young people are Dimpho Lekgeu, who is a community manager at Youth Lab, and YT ConsultingAfrica co-founder Kenneth Diole, who is also a member of SAIIA's National Council. Dimpho and Kenneth, thanks so much for your time. Happy Youth Day. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina. Thank you for having us, and happy Youth Day to you and Kenneth.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. I hope it is a happy Youth Day to many young people out there.
Well, you know, I'm just so keen to actually pulse where you are at as young people 45 years after those June 76 uprisings by students in this country who felt that they could no longer continue on the trajectory that the country was on, felt that their parents were perhaps a bit too passive in dealing with the issues confronting not just the youth, but Black South Africans of the day. And here we are, 45 years after that day. And I'd like to know what your reflections are today. Let me start with you, Dimpho.
So, I mean, the 16th of June is a time of reflection, like you mentioned, right? And it's usually a time where we reflect on what the youth of 1976 did through the Soweto uprising, and we really reflect on how far we've come. But unfortunately, at the beginning of the year, we almost saw the same thing that happened on the 16th of June in 1976 play itself out again in Braamfontein, when students from Wits University were protesting for a better funding model for higher education. And they were met with the same violence, they were met with the same hostility from the state as the youth of 1976. Now, the only disappointing thing is that 45 years later, the same thing is playing itself out. Young people are taking to the streets to protest against a system that's not serving them, that's oppressive to largely young Black people. And they're being met with violence, but this time around from a Black government. And you can't reflect on youth or the state of youth without talking about whether young people are at the forefront of social and economic participation in our country. And unfortunately, they're not. They're on the periphery, even though they make up a majority of our country's population. 7 out of 10 young people are unemployed or can't access post-school or some kind of economic opportunity. So what kind of freedom do you have if young people don't have a stake in the economy?
Your reflections, Kenneth?
Yeah, I think firstly, you know, the first element of it is really we ought to take a moment and commemorate the gallant class of 1976. It is on the back of their shoulders that we stand and have the privilege to have this conversation in the first place. And so there is that, because we recognize the tremendous sacrifice that they made and how they've pushed the youth agenda to the table since this day 45 years ago, as you state, in the first instance. The second part, I think, one, we have to look at the journey till today, right? Has young people been included in many things that Dimpho has already spoken about? You know, youth participation becomes a paramount conversation in South Africa's democratic dispensation. Have we included young people sufficiently in key decision-making spaces? You know, the economic conversation, the political process, and really social movements, and some which have been largely led by young people. That is an important part of reflection. But I think thirdly, and arguably most important for me, is to reflect on the state of youth today, which is, as Dimpho has already mentioned, the fact that, you know, the youth unemployment unemployment continues to skyrocket. And it's not something that necessarily was caused by COVID. It was fundamentally exacerbated by COVID, but has been a key issue for the last 10 years or so. And that's an issue that we must discuss in depth and understand how we're going to include young people in that process. And number two, I think, is the acknowledgement that even when we speak as young people, there are many that we do not represent and whose views are often excluded. Young people who find themselves in rural areas, young people who are in the peri-urban areas, and young people who are excluded from institutions of learning, who are excluded from learning opportunities, and who are excluded from employment opportunities. There's many issues that surround youth as a broad context and that we generally have to deal with. And I think most of them are also not exclusive, but are fundamentally exacerbated when we think about them in the youth context. And I think that's the position that I really think about on a day like this, where we ask the question around when are we going to stop doing lip service to young people and actually make tremendous steps to ensure that we reform the economy, we include young people in the process, and we create an enabling environment for young people to be part and parcel of this economy and finally be empowered.
And I love that you mentioned that, Kenneth, because we have to move past the platitudes if we go on just the figures that both you and Dimpho made reference to. And there are so many more figures that paint a very bleak picture of the fate of our youth in this country at the moment. Almost 75% of the youth are making up the unemployment ranks, which is a totally untenable situation. But in speaking about inclusion and access, 150 young people participated in the conference that we are talking about. Now, as you say, by the numbers that we are churning out, we're talking about a constituency of 60% of youth making up our demographic as a country. So just in terms of that, if you look at the location, as you spoke about rural youth, you look about the education, you look at the skill set, the range of professions, and we can go on and list a myriad of other issues as well. But just from that, 150 young people sitting to discuss the fate of 60% of this country's population, which are youth. How inclusive is that? And does it really speak for young people? Does it really give us a sense of the youth, where they are and what they want? Let me start with you, Kenneth, and then Dimpho, you can have a bite as well.
Yeah. Well, I think what is important about the process, so maybe let me give context to the process, right? The African Peer Review Mechanism, the APRM, is a governance instrument of the African Union. And, it's about how African countries can compare their governance levels across different departments and sectors with each other. And for every couple of years, they do obviously a review. And this year, SAIIA, in partnership with Jasawa Consulting, decided to really focus on young people's voice to see what are their thoughts on South Africa's governance in those 9 key areas that you mentioned in the introduction, right? I think to your point around the 150 young people, I think none of the 150 young people, myself included, were ever of the illusion that we represent in the entire youth demographic, but it was with the importance of understanding that we are bringing young people who we are able to bring to the table. Number one. Number two, these young people come with them with a number of lived experiences. Myself, having the access that I do, I'm also a child born in a village, raised in a township, and have had access to schooling in small towns, and eventually find myself where, in the spaces that we find ourselves in. So most of those young people come with multiple lived experiences, number one. Number two, they were representatives of different institutions. So some from universities, some who are postgraduate studies, some who are members of NGOs, NPOs, civil society, broader civil society, and in some cases private sector. And so their insights are important, and we're not saying that are representative of the 60 plus representation of the youth population in this country, but really are some of the sentiments that can be found within that broad youth cohort in South Africa. I think, secondly, what is also paramount to recognize here is that this is also an opportunity for us to reflect that when young people are given the opportunity and the resources to participate in a process, they will ultimately take that process into their hands. The process was not a conference, it was about a 6-month journey from start to finish. And over that period, young people were provided with the necessary equipment, whether it was digital device, laptops, and meeting places so that we could create as much as we can a fertile environment environment for most of them to come and participate as meaningfully as they can. So there is that acknowledgement that we have to make. And so we're not saying we're representing everybody, but we're saying that the voices of youth were represented. And this is but what can happen when young people are given the opportunity. My last point will really be that the process is meaningful, because I think ultimately what you will find in a country like ours, where there's so many youth-related challenges, is that there's going to be a lot of, whether it's organization or events that are going to happen, where young people themselves and people who are in support of youth will fundamentally want to form part of the process. And I think this was but a critical one for us to reflect on and to say, what are the insights when we look at this particular document that these 150 or so young people have produced? So I'll use one group, for example, at institutional planning, which was the group that I formed part and parcel of. We looked at the fact that we know when we look at a global level, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the African Union's Agenda 2063, and when you come into South Africa, the National Youth Strategy, which was also in revision last year and is revised every 5 years. How many of those goals and goals that are encumbered by these policies have been achieved? What needs to be done? And how do we ensure that young people form part and parcel of that process and can be the custodians of their own views and actually representatives in the various areas, whether in policy making, in private sector, and civil society? And I think there's a lot of key outcomes in that particular areas that we recognize. Like I'll share two. The first one was really that at an institutional planning, as an example, number one was that, look, South Africa, and many people have said this before, we are very good at planning and coming up with the relevant documentation, but we're not very good at executing that. But also these young people went even further and said, we need also a monitoring and evaluation instrument that forms part and parcel of how these particular policy documents will be implemented. And over and above that, the budget allocation, so that we can actually measure from start to finish and see the progress, see the loopholes, see the inclusionary phases, and see what are the areas that we need to, have much more concerted effort in bringing to fruition the outcomes of some of those particular document recommendations.
Okay. Dimpho, hold your thoughts. I want to push this a little further because I need to understand in terms of inclusion once more. Were there youth who are unemployed youth? Were they represented? Were they given a voice? Youth who are recovering drug addicts, for example, were they given a voice here? Because these are all the sort of issues that we are dealing with. Teen mothers, teen parents. All of these issues are important because we cannot continue on the same path that governments in South Africa and across the continent are continuing on, because this is what has landed us in the situation where our youth feel disenfranchised and despondent. They feel hopeless in certain instances because things are not happening. So it cannot be business as usual. Something needs to give. Something more needs to be done. But we have to say goodbye to our SABC2 viewers, unfortunately, at this point. We will continue the conversation on SABC News after the 8 o'clock news with Dimpho and Kenneth, because I think very important, not just for today, but of course going forward. We'll also focus on some of what was covered during the discussions at the SAIIA Council and obviously the focus areas around governance and how this is going to improve the lot of young people in this country. So to our SABC 2 viewers, please hope it is a meaningful day. Enjoy it, be blessed, be safe, and we'll be back with you tomorrow. But of course, we still have another hour of Morning Live to continue on SABC News, and Leanne will have the 8 o'clock news for us, after which we will continue with our guests, continuing this conversation on youth and where they find themselves today and how exactly do we move this situation forward, also reflecting on some of the points that came out of the conference that was held. So all of that to come. Please take care. It's 8 o'clock, Leanne, or just about a minute and a half to 8. Leanne will have the news at 8 for us, and then we'll continue with that discussion. Right.
Yeah, indeed I will. Thanks very much, Sakina. And also thanks to you for watching this Youth Day edition of Morning Live and sending us your views and comments. We've got a lot of them that have already come through. So what we're going to do is read some of them to you in the next hour and, of course, continue that discussion. But until tomorrow morning, have a lovely day, whatever you do, and we'll see you safe and sound at 6 o'clock. Bye-bye. President Cyril Ramaphosa has announced that the Youth Day celebrations at Maritzburg in Kwazulu-Natal will go ahead today. However, it'll now be a hybrid event compliant with level 3 of the lockdown. The theme this year is the year of Charlotte Maxeke, growing youth employment for an inclusive and transformed society. The litmus test of Ramaphosa's address will be what he has to offer the youth. Already, Ramaphosa had said youth unemployment is his government's biggest concern. COVID-19 regulations are to be enforced in Maritzburg for the commemoration. Ramaphosa says there will be a significantly reduced number of people attending the Maritzburg event, and he will give a virtual address. DA leader John Steenhuisen is meanwhile expected to address the youth from Mitchell's Plain on the Cape Flats. Among the issues Steenhuisen is expected to address is the youth unemployment rate. Cooperative Governance Minister Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma has gazetted the new Level 3 lockdown restrictions. President Cyril Ramaphosa announced last night that the country would enter Level 3 of the lockdown at midnight as the number of new coronavirus infections continues to rise.
A third wave of infections is upon us. We have to contain this new wave of infections.
It was only a matter of time before another family meeting. Coronavirus cases now on the rise again.
In view of the rising infections, the Cabinet has therefore decided to move the country to Alert Level 3. We have received an indication from Johnson & Johnson that it expects to deliver around 2 million vaccines to South Africa by the end of the month, thus replacing those 2 million doses that had to be destroyed.
Under Level 3, the curfew will now move to 10 p.m. until 4 a.m. Numbers of people at gatherings has also been reduced.
We each have a responsibility to take the necessary action to protect ourselves and others. It is up to each one of us to limit the risk to ourselves and others.
President Ramaphosa has expressed concern about the rate of coronavirus infections in many parts of the country, especially in Gauteng. He says Gauteng accounts for 2/3 of the new infections and has called on South Africans to go back to basics of wearing masks, washing hands and sanitizing. Ntantla Khatlani, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Meanwhile, 8,436 new cases of COVID-19 have been reported in the last 24-hour cycle. Active cases have now increased to over 86,000. The Health Department has also reported another 208 deaths, taking the death toll to 58,000 and just over 58,000. Our recovery rate stands at 91.8%. The increase in the new cases represents a positivity rate of 17.8%, and the vast majority of the new infections were once again recorded in Gauteng. All right, that wraps up our news at 8. Headlines coming your way at 8:30. Right, let's get you a weather update. And Bobby standing by here. And Bobby, how are we looking out there today? I mean, I know here I think it's going to be quite a nice day, but what about the rest of the country?
Well, there is a little bit of rain expected for Cape Town and also along the coastal regions of the Eastern Cape. But into the weekend, though, I should let you know that there's a bit of a cold spell coming.
For here, in Gauteng?
Yes, there is. Just a little bit.
All right, I mean, I know. It's expected.
It is winter, Leanne.
I know. Well, it isn't it? 21st of June, am I right? Isn't that the official start of winter?
No, we are actually in winter now.
It is winter. No, seriously. I mean, I had this argument. Well, I had a discussion with my kids because they were saying, are we in winter or are we still in autumn? Because when you look at official winter date, it is the 21st of June. So
they do. It is, but we actually, meteorologically, we are already in winter. It's the 1st of June.
All right. See, I don't argue with meteorologists. I leave it to you. So I now know we are in winter. So, okay, it's expected. Cold fronts, bring them on. Let's get the weather from you, Bobby.
Thank you, Leanne. Welcome to the Weather Desk. Now, taking a look at today's forecast, it's still cloudy conditions expected over into the Eastern Cape and also spreading over into the southern parts of the KZN province. Light rain is expected along the coastal regions of the Eastern Cape for this morning, but it has begun to clear. Now, there is also morning fog patches expected along the coastal regions of the Western Cape, and also as that cold front does move through, light rain is also expected along the coastal regions of the Western Cape later on for today. Temperatures are expected to be cool but warm along the coastal regions, especially over into the KZN province, where